do put up your hand. Okay, now the trouble is I've got more stuff than I should, so I need to get going. This is going to be a personal voyage. What I think I'm trying to do is to think through a problem that I still don't feel I've got on top of, which is how do you do the segue across all the scales, from the very large scale to the scales of professional scholarship. And I'm a historian, so I'm thinking of how I make this move so I show professional historians that there are ideas at the big history scale that really do matter at conventional scales of research. Let me begin with this icon, why I love this painting. This is Starry Night over the Rhone. I've used it a lot as an icon for big history, and this is why. We have stars and cosmos, so we've got cosmology and astronomy. We've got planet Earth, so we've got geology. We've got water, where life evolves, so we've got chemistry and biology. Okay, is the sound okay? I have to hold it exactly the right place. So we've got cities, churches, and human civilization. We've got anthropology and history. We've got high-tech. We've got electric lights and modernity, so we've got science and technology. And finally, we've got you and me trying to figure out our place in the universe. And this, for me, captures very nicely and very simply the ambition of big history to sort of connect disciplines. I think the title I was given for this lecture is a license to ramble, be scared, be very scared. It's a license to ramble through the cosmos. But in a sense, aren't we all doing that? So forgive me if this lecture too sounds a bit like a ramble, but this particular group of ramblers, you'll actually be able to spot most of them at this conference. This picture was taken near Col di Gioco in a quarry where Walter Alvarez led a wonderful seminar in 2010, where we founded the International Big History Association. It was a wonderful seminar, and it's very exciting to see how far it's gone since then. I was the first president. I ceased to be president about 24 hours ago. And Fred has taken over. But I'm immensely proud of being first president and very honoured to have been invited to give this talk. Big history is exploratory. David Blanks just said to me, "You're not going to use that Francis Bacon picture." And I said, "Yes, I am." So here we are. I like it. I think it's a good image for science. It was an original image when he first used it in the early 17th century of knowledge as exploratory, finding new intellectual continents, new seas, new connections. And that, for me, is what big history's been about. It's been a very exciting exploratory journey. So forgive me if what I say is a bit exploratory today, too. There'll be many, many big history voyages. I'm going to talk about a personal one, but I'm aware that there'll be many, many of them. But I think many of them start out with the same goal of trying to see things whole. And I'll argue that in today's world, the way education and research are organised, it's not easy. It's really tough. So the starting point for me, and I suspect for many others in this room, is a deeply disillusioning experience, but one that we then buried beneath our subconscious and forgot about. You go to school, that could be me. I went to an English public school, so it really could be me with a cap and short trousers and a tie. And you're full of questions. You want to know about stars, about what it means to be a human being, about the cosmos, about how everything began. You want to know about dinosaurs. You want to know about the meaning of life. And you go to school and you think, this is the place where I'm going to learn all of these things. And you start asking big questions. And you make a complete idiot of yourself. Because your teachers reply, now they never say it quite like this, but kids aren't stupid. We understand the subtext. So what I'm going to say is the subtext of what our teachers are trying to teach us. The subtext is, shut up about the meaning of life, and get on with your algebra, your Latin verbs, your English history. Now, I suspect many in this room have had that experience, but then you buried it so deep that you've forgotten it. And what you learned was a very sad lesson, that schools are not the place to ask big, important questions. Forget about them. And you may be thinking, if schools aren't the place, where the hell do I go? But schools aren't the place, apparently, in today's world, because education is organised in fragments, and really big questions cannot fit within the disciplinary silos of modern education. And that's why they get sort of ruled out of education. Now, this is actually, it took me a long time to realise how odd this is. Modern education is very strange in this respect. In most societies we know of, and I think an anthropologist would find this a reasonably plausible statement, educators wanted you to ask me questions, and that was because education was framed by what I call origin stories. Now, I think of these, and this is a metaphor, one could disagree with the metaphor, but I think of these as all-embracing maps of time and space, attempts to grasp reality more or less whole. And they seem to have lain at the heart of religious and educational traditions. This is why Durkheim famously said there is no religion that is not a cosmology at the same time, a map of everything in which you can place yourself. So there's a sense in which I think mapping itself is meaning. Now, we've been arguing about this in our board meetings, where Walter told me that the word meaning can be interpreted, has different meanings in different environments. So let me stick with this metaphor of mapping. Knowing where you are means you know important things. You know where you are, where you can go, what you can do, what possibilities are available to you. And that, I think, is, in some senses, the start of meaning. So origin stories offer comprehensive maps of time and space. They allow us to place ourselves in a vast cosmos. Now, this problem of educational fragmentation, I think, is part of a larger problem in modern society that's very familiar. It's a major theme of 19th and 20th century thought. A sense of lost bearings, of meaninglessness. It's been diagnosed by philosophers, by sociologists, by novelists, by economists, by political scientists. All the great thinkers, Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, Weber, Freud, Joyce, all talked about this. Emil Durkheim called it anomie. And one of his earliest publications was about suicide. And he saw anomie, this loss of bearings, this absence of a map, as something that could drive people to suicide. It's serious, it really matters. And I'd like to give you what for me is a very beautiful attempt to capture the tragedy of the sense of loss of faith. And this is, many of you will know this, Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach. For me, it's a wonderful description of this. And for him, of course, the sense of meaning that was lost was embedded in the Christian tradition. And he wrote, "The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world." How bleak is that? But it gets even bleaker, as you may remember. Our love, let us be true to one another, for the world, which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. Again, how bleak is that? That's a sort of account of the seriousness of this problem of anomie in the modern world. And it leaves us, in the modern world, looking for bearings in this vast tsunami of knowledge that has come to us with modern science and modern scholarship. How do we find our bearings? Are we doomed to anomie? Now, I actually think there may be two options here. One is, yes, the sense of meaningless is a part of modernity. It's the world we live in. And so the solution is live with it. Suck it up. Get used to it. Just deal with it. Don't whine about it. There's a second alternative there. It is that we're living in a sort of intellectual building site. We're in the early stages of building a new unifying story that is constructed from the raw materials generated by modern scientific scholarship. And that, I think, is the path taken by big history, because I think big history is trying to describe that story as it's emerging. It's not a perfect story in any way. It's trying to describe it and help people get their bearings within that story. So that's why I find it immensely hopeful. I see big history as part of the solution to the problem of anomie. And it seems to be succeeding. This is a comment from a student from one of our pilot schools in Australia, Somerville House School in Brisbane. Big history was an incredible learning experience because it allowed me to gain knowledge about the question, how did humans get here today? And this is the question I have asked myself all my life. I think big history is allowing students to ask those questions that I was desperate to ask, but could never really get an answer to. So big history offers education and a framework so broad that we really can ask some very big questions. No guarantees we'll get clear answers, but we can pursue those questions. We can be encouraged to do them within the big history framework. The beginning of big history journeys. When I began, I thought, boy, was I a pioneer in 1989. I didn't even know about world history. And then over the years, I've discovered I'm one of thousands and thousands of people trying to pursue the same journey. From traditional storytellers, I live and teach in Australia, and there's a 60,000-year tradition there of big history. We often call it patronisingly dreamtime stories or something like that. From medieval chronicles to Alexander von Humboldt, Fred has spent a lot of time reminding us that Alexander von Humboldt may have been one of the first modern big historians. Eric Chaisson in Boston has been doing it since the 1970s. Carl Sagan did it in the 1980s. I'm a late comer. I started only in 1989 trying to do this. By 2010, everybody's doing it. The IBHA, the Big History Project, Dominican, doing it wonderfully on a huge scale. 300 pilot schools for our Big History Project. Ann Arbor, Grand Rapids, Amsterdam, Equine, Seoul, Maine, Fullerton, LA, Melbourne, Brisbane, St. Louis. Lots more places are doing it. It's happening a lot. And today, I personally set up my tent at the Big History Institute at Macquarie, created in 2012 with my colleagues Tracy Sullivan and Andrew McKenna, who are both here. So now I want to talk a bit more about my personal voyage. I've been given a license to talk more personally. It's one of millions. I'm not going to go through all of these photographs. I spent much of my life looking for coherence. I think of myself as, I use the phrase framework thinker. The details never quite made sense to me unless I could put them into a larger frame. So I was always looking for a larger frame. Even as a kid, I remember it very vividly. The details never satisfied me without the frame. I looked for coherence in religion, and my parents took me to Anglican church services. Very tedious. It never quite did it for me. I was fascinated as a teenager by Russian thought. I read Dostoevsky, I read Tolstoy. It's really big. And at Oxford I heard Isaiah Berlin explain how big it is. And that was exciting. That was riveting, absolutely riveting. I did graduate work at Oxford. My graduate work was microscopic. I studied a failed Russian reform between 1801 and 1803. It went nowhere. Nothing happened. I spent 4 years studying it. I worked in archives in Leningrad. I think I've been in intellectual retreat ever since. And looking for a balance between frame and detail, because I think all good knowledge must be based on that balance between the very large and the detail, but achieving it is very difficult. So I then became a university teacher with all the many, many privileges that implies. And one of the great privileges is if no one ever taught it to you, you can offer to inflict it on your students, which means you learn it. And so I volunteered to teach a course in big history. And that's how I started. In 1989. I invited lecturers from many other departments, and they did great lectures, but the course as a whole didn't hang together. Each used their own disciplinary terminology, but students loved the questions we were asking, even if the answers we offered were pretty incoherent at that stage. And that's what's kept me going ever since. The sense that students are finding something very meaningful, even in the project of telling a very large story. So we kept going, and I'm still going 25 years later. But over time, a larger story slowly came into focus, and I began to see the coherence of all of this. And I also eventually realized that it's a very ancient journey. I realized how many had taken the same journey before me. The journey was ancient, it was familiar, but it was also a very new journey, because it was based on modern science. And a lot of the crucial science kicked in the second half of the 20th century. H.G. Wells tried to tell the story. It was undoable in 1919, when he wrote just after the First World War. So it's a new story, it's unfamiliar, and it's using the insights of modern science to try to construct a coherent map of reality. And doing that, I think we're reaching some new destinations. And I want to try and talk about some of them, some of the ones I think I'm heading towards. What have we found? Here's a half-remembered exchange from the first IBHA conference. Someone said, I see big history inventing an entirely new language and a new conceptual toolkit for thinking across disciplines. That idea has been rattling around in my brain ever since, and I think it's dead right. If you're thinking across disciplines, you find yourself translating all the time. This is collective learning at work. You're sharing ideas, but you're sharing ideas with people who use them in just slightly different ways. So to talk across disciplines, you have to constantly tweak your concepts, tweak your vocabulary. I think sometimes it's a bit like taking a crystal and taking tiny adjustments. And each adjustment can give you a new perspective. And eventually, I think those new perspectives can take you deeper. They can help you see the deeper meaning of familiar concepts. So I want to describe some big history epiphanies. 3 types that I'll talk about. Beginnings of a new vocabulary, new ways of teaching, and then new unifying concepts and research agendas. So let me begin with the new vocabulary, the unifying vocabulary. Those of us teaching big history have simply had to find words that do the job we need them to do. And very often we're taking old concepts and trying to stretch them across disciplines. Increasing complexity is one. Eric Chaisson really pointed the way with this. The idea that there is a big story of increasing complexity. The idea that that story is associated with energy flows. To understand why it's possible, you have to see that there are gradients of energy, of density, of gradients of many kinds that allow energy flows, and these allow the creation of complexity. That complexity emerges in what Stephen Jay Gould would call punctuations. Suddenly, existing things get assembled in a new way, and that new structure has qualities that never existed before. So think of a universe without life, and then a universe with life. Suddenly new things. The idea of emergence, I think, is the appropriate way of thinking about this. There's nothing magical about this. It's simply, take several things, assemble them in a new way, and you have new qualities that didn't exist before. The idea of Goldilocks principles, which Fred has developed in very interesting ways. It's not that the universe gets more complex. The complexity appears in tiny pockets in the universe, but it only appears where the conditions are just right, where the density is not too high, not too low, the temperatures are not too high, not too low, and so on. The idea of collective learning, an idea that I sort of cobbled together to try to make sense of the role of humans in early lectures in these courses, and it now looks to me a more and more powerful idea. The idea that what distinguishes us as a species is that we can share information with such precision that that information doesn't leak away, as it does with chimps, but it accumulates for us. And that accumulation is what sets us apart from every other living organism in 3.8 billion years. That's a large claim. I'll come back to it in a bit. The idea of world zones, Jared Diamond talks about this, the idea that human history is played out completely separately, almost as if on different planets. And those world zones provide an interesting experiment. They allow you to see what things are going to happen wherever you put humans, and what things are shaped by particular environments. And that's a thing I'll come back to too. And we see contingency at multiple scales. As some people say, a big history story is bound to be deterministic. Very, very wrong. And Walter has shown us this big time. Accidents matter at many, many scales. Big history is deeply contingent at multiple scales, not just at the quantum scale. There are sort of analogues to the quantum scale at many different scales, including those of geology. We see large, slow trends, but we also see unpredictable panics, sudden periods where you don't know what's happening, and everything changes. This was just a year and a half ago, February the 15th, 2013, a 10,000-ton meteorite I think it was the largest in 100 years, landed nearly near Chelyabinsk and nearly did in Chelyabinsk. If it had landed in the center, it would have been a catastrophe. Chelyabinsk got away with it. This is the vapor trail, 18 minutes after it landed just outside Chelyabinsk. The dinosaurs didn't, 67 million years ago. And of course, this is what Walter has taught us. So contingency is important. We're learning new ways of teaching, lots of new ways of teaching. We're learning, and again, Dominican is really pioneering here, what it means to teach across multiple disciplines, how you help students struggle across disciplines, how you show the connections. The idea of claim testers, thanks to Bob Bain for developing this, is wonderful because it empowers students to check what they're being told all the time against their intuitions, their evidence, and so on. And it helps students take charge of knowledge and think critically, not just accept this as a given story. The idea of little big histories, thanks to Esther Quilakis for this, a wonderful idea. Great way of helping people into big history who find it easier to go through the detail. So go in through the detail and then open it up to the very large story by taking something small and trying to explore it at big history scales. Threshold 9, this is an idea that's bubbled up from our pilot schools. We talk about 8 thresholds. So kids start saying, okay, so what's threshold 9? And will it happen in my lifetime? Fantastic question. And I think, I take great pride in this because I think big history is helping students think rigorously and seriously about the future. And in a very rapidly changing world, that's immensely important. The idea of simply providing free online resources available to everyone, thanks to the Big History Project and to Bill Gates for that. It's been wonderful. It's been a wonderful driver for big history. Let me give just one example here, claim testers. And here's a comment again from Somerville House in Brisbane. The claim testers, I don't know if you know what they are, but they're simply questions you ask yourself when you decide to accept or reject an idea. They're an age-appropriate way of exploring epistemology. They're a sort of epistemological toolkit. How do students know what they know? Are they told by authority? So the student should say, did I believe that simply because I trust my teacher? Did they use logic to work it out? Did I believe it because I know something else is true and I figured out that they're logically connected? Have they examined evidence, claim tester 3, or did they intuit the knowledge? It's really important to ask yourself that question. Did I just ultimately go on gut feeling here? Students are discouraged from simply accepting knowledge and encouraged to analyse why they know. Maddie L. wrote, "The Big History gives students, as a student, the power to take on the course from different points of view. We were allowed to challenge concepts within the course." Natalie T. "The claims testers we use to evaluate information were a skill essential for life in general. It's helpful to know why I trust what someone says." And Emily L. "The critical thinking and claims testing skills developed throughout this process have also had useful applications in other subjects." Now I want to go on to some of the big ideas that interest me, that I think are emerging as we look across disciplines, new unifying ideas, or very often they're not new, they're simply seeing old ideas in a slightly new way. Big history is fabulous at teasing out what I call intellectual synergies between disciplines. As you try to link ideas, concepts, information, as I've said, you have to sort of keep tweaking them so that the word holds up across multiple disciplines. And that tweaking process forces you to see things in slightly new ways, and new perspectives emerge with a clunk. I'm actually trying to be really cute here and find a clunk audio file and put it into my presentation, but thank God I couldn't do it. You know what I mean? So let's take one. Let's take this wonderful insight that dominates the textbook that I've written with Cynthia Brown and Craig Benjamin. Energy and complexity. Eric Chason and Fred Spear have developed these insights. So the early universe was very simple, had very little structure. There's a thin mist of hydrogen and helium atoms. We're talking about the universe a few million years after the Big Bang. There were photons of light, there are tiny energy differences. And this iconic image of the cosmic background radiation tells you how small those energy differences were. Differences of about 1,000th of a degree. That's all. It's a very smooth, homogeneous universe. No galaxies and stars, no heavier chemical elements, no planets, no living organisms or humans. Then, over 13.8 billion years, more complex things emerged in pockets. Most of the universe is still very simple, but in pockets where the Goldilocks conditions were right, such as the surface of a rocky planet like our Earth, and where there are gradients that allow energy flows, more complex things have appeared with new qualities, and larger energy flows as they get more complex. And this is an interesting story for us, because modern human society seems to represent a very high level of complexity. Okay, so if this story is right, how can we link it to the research of ordinary historians? I'm a historian, but this question applies in field after field. Sheila Fitzpatrick, some of you will know, is one of the great historians of the Soviet Union, particularly of Stalinism. This is my field, this is what I taught in for years, so she's a very important figure. And she lives in Sydney, and she once said to me, David, I'm intrigued by big history, but I'm worried that it threatens to devalue the work of my entire career as a historian of the Soviet Union. Now, I give this question because I couldn't figure out quite what is the best response. She's wrong, of course. There's no sense in which this devalues it. But can we demonstrate to historians, that's my try, that big history does not devalue traditional research? We need the detail, but we also need the frame. I'd like to be able to demonstrate that the insights of big history can be illuminating. And I feel that I failed to demonstrate this to Sheila Fitzpatrick. So this question is still worrying, gnawing away at me, and I'm struggling with it. So here are some attempts to think it through. I'm embarrassed by how long I've taken to see the links between big history themes and my research as a historian, but I'm beginning to see them, particularly as now I'm going back to work on Russian history. So plunk. Here is a big history question. For historians, if increasing complexity fueled by flows of free energy provide a major theme for big history, shouldn't historians focus much more than they do on changing energy flows and their implications for human history? So let me try and think this one through. Well, collective learning and energy flows, these ideas together generate a simple periodization of human history. Collective learning, as I understand it, creates this constant sharing of ideas, which leads to kind of constant tweaking of ideas. And that's the source of innovation and technology, new technologies, new ideas, new ways of dealing with the environment in human history, the steady trickle of new ideas. Most of those ideas are trivial. They don't have large consequences. But some of them, occasionally you stumble on an idea that's colossal. And two complexes of ideas, I think, have given shape to human history. They're both energy technologies, thresholds in human history. The first I call the organic energy regime. It is generated by agricultural technologies from about 10,000 years ago. Farmers rearranged their surroundings so as to increase the productivity of plants and animals that they could use and reduce the productivity of ones they couldn't. The end result of this is that more of the photosynthetic energy that flows through the biosphere is available to one species, our own. This is an energy grab. So populations begin to rise, and you create surpluses. Now those surpluses were not large enough to be spread over the whole of society. They could support small elites. So they create the world, the agrarian world. Then the second great threshold is the fossil fuels energy regime. Just 200 years ago, it's created our world, industrial technologies. That tapped sunlight that had been captured. They're both tapping sunlight, but this tapped sunlight that had been captured, buried, and fossilized over 300 million years, and allowed a vast increase in available energy. So populations and consumption rose on a huge scale. I've recently been reading John L. Brooks' Climate Change in the Course of Global History, which advertises itself as a work in big history. John L. Brooks was originally an American historian. I think it's a fabulous book. And here's a graph from that book, which, if you want a one-page summary of modernity, does a pretty good job. The blue line is 1800, and look at the hooks at the end of it.
They show the upturn in population, life expectancy, GDP, CO2 emissions. He's a climate historian, remember. Atmospheric CO2 and methane, and northern hemisphere temperatures. That's the fossil fuels revolution, and that's the upkick that it generated. So welcome to the Anthropocene. This is a slide I used it 2 years ago, talk I gave, some may recognize it. And as I said, there's good reasons for thinking this is the first time in 3.8 billion years that a single species has controlled such huge flows of energy and resources that it dominates the biosphere. So what is going on? This slide I also love, taken by a Ukrainian photographer. Unfortunately, I discovered later it's a composite. I thought at the time it was those are British hurricanes flying over Murmansk. It captures the idea. This is the Anthropocene up close and personal. I took these pictures. This is the Mer de Glace in the Mont Blanc Massif in 2010, one of the great glaciers. And here is my friend and colleague, Craig Benjamin, at the notice that reads the level of the glacier in 1990. Now I put this here because this came as a real shock to me. This really brought it home to me, what the Anthropocene means. So can we explain the Anthropocene? Here's a biospheric perspective. Well, actually let me begin with a non-biospheric perspective. Standard wisdom for historians. The big question for historians over the last 100 years has been how do you explain modernity? And there's a standard story. It's markets that drive modernity. It's the freedom to engage in entrepreneurial activity. It's market competition. It's capitalism. Whatever version you choose, that's the driver of modernity. You want to understand today's world, that's what we need to focus on. Economics. Market efficiencies, accelerated innovation. It's a natural idea in a siloized history discipline which tries to explain everything staying within the bounds of human society and largely ignoring the biosphere. But here's a biospheric view. Fossil fuels are the main driver, not markets. Markets are important, but fossil fuels are the main driver. Ian Wrigley has developed this story. He pointed out that even the great classical economists, such as Smith and Ricardo, although we've forgotten this, they never thought growth would go on forever. They thought growth would peter out. They thought markets would generate innovation and growth, but there was a limit. There were constraints to growth. Market efficiencies get you asymptotically closer to these limits. They don't take you beyond them. And by 1800, market efficiencies had taken the Netherlands, one of the most highly developed market societies in the world, close to existing energy limits, and growth was slowing down. Now the limits were those of the organic economy, the agricultural economy. Energy came from recent photosynthesis, wood, wind, animal, and human labour. And there was a limit. Land, the area of land set the limits. Now modern societies arise from different energy flows. They also begin in the heart of the sun. Here's a wonderful graph from E.A. Wrigley's work. And it's about what happened in England at the same time. And it shows English consumption of energy from the 16th century to the mid-19th century. England got lucky. It had coal near the surface, accessible, and also near seaports, so to be moved around the country. Here are roughly the energy limits of the organic economy. Above that line, you see the energy increment that the English economy got from coal. This is Italy in 1850. So spot the difference. Italy was not yet in the fossil fuels economy. Now, what happened? Using coal, the English economy could break through the constraints of the organic economy. At first, coal was used for heat energy in the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries, but that already had a huge impact. It lowered the costs of many forms of manufacturing, brewing, brickmaking, glassmaking. Brickmaking and glassmaking changed housing. It stimulated innovations in transportation. These businesses flourished, creating more employment, which changed demographic structures, allowing people to marry younger and generating larger populations. So already, coal as heat energy had a huge impact. Then, from the late 18th century, we get an efficient steam engine, and now we have coal being turned into mechanical energy. Effectively, what coal did was increase the area of England increase the area of woodland, okay, from which you can get heat, and also create a vast, cheap, virtual labour force. Here are some calculations from Wrigley. In 1750, coal provided the equivalent of 4.3 million acres of woodland. That was about 13% of the area of Britain, of England and Wales. By 1800, 11.2 million acres, that's about 25%. By 1850, coal was providing the equivalent of 150% of the total area of England and Wales. That is very, very significant, and your economy is going to be very different. And here's some calculations about mechanical energy. A coal miner, using about 1 horsepower of his own energy, could produce enough coal to generate 27 times that much energy when the coal was used by a steam engine operating at 1% efficiency. Now, I'm not going to be tied down to the details of this calculation. It's the large magnitudes that are important. We've magnified the labour of that miner by 26 times by using the coal in steam engines. This is a staggering change. Now, collective learning kicks in at this point. Once the technologies have been generated and people know about them, they go hunting for them. Okay? Other countries learned about these technologies very early on. In 1755, a Professor J. Robison, who was working in Russia and was a friend of Watt, tried to invite Watt to Russia. How different what history might have been if he'd done that. 1778, Count Chernyshev, naval minister, wrote to Count Musin Pushkin, ambassador in London, about the possibility of inviting Watt's patron, Matthew Boulton, to Russia. This collective learning getting going. In 1803, the first steam engine was introduced in Russia at Olonets Iron Works for the St. Petersburg Mint. So once the technology is there, it can spread very rapidly. And within a century and a half, it's spread around the world. And here is a graph of energy consumption in the world since 1850 from Alfred Crosby's Children of the Sun. And again, I'm not sure that it really needs any comment, except to say that almost all of the energy above that line is from fossil fuels there. So with more energy, populations soar. This is the organic energy regime. Here's the modern world powered by fossil fuels. We have now enough energy to increase consumption for more than elites, so per capita growth can begin to rise. It's hardly risen at all for 10,000 years. Now it can begin to rise. Now, I've fiddled the graph here. This is any of you interested in how to sort of present statistics in exaggerated ways. I've done it. But I hope you get the point. There is a significant difference here between these two regimes. And the conclusion, modernity is the result of an energy bonanza. It's like striking gold, except what was struck was energy. Market efficiencies alone cannot explain modernity. We should not put it all down to economics. Markets encourage innovations, yes, and they encourage people to stumble across the critical innovation thresholds. But sunlight is the driver, fossilized sunlight. Here's Ricky. An industrial revolution is physically impossible without access to energy on a scale which does not exist and cannot be secured in organic economies. Fossil fuels provided, and now we go back to Chasson, the steep energy gradients that drive modern societies and that explain why modern society is so elaborate and so complex. Now, the best proof that markets alone did not create the modern world is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union modernized without markets. Here's a graph I've constructed, which is similar to the one I showed you earlier. And once again, this is energy use in the Soviet Union since 1928. And basically all of this stuff is natural gas, oil, and coal. That's fossilized sunlight. And here's a graph of coal and oil consumption in modern Russian and Soviet history. The point where the arrow is where markets vanish and the first 5-year plan, Stalin's 5-year plan, begins. And look at the increase in available fossil fuels. But this is a slide from Joe Voros. My thanks to Joe Voros. It's not going to last. It's a bonanza. So another way of reason for thinking of it is a bit like a gold struck. That's Joe's wonderful graph of peak oil. It'll be over in a few centuries. It may seem a long time from some perspectives, not from others. It'll take 100 million years to renew the fuels we've used. So that means, that perspective on the Industrial Revolution means that we need to understand modernity in the context of the biosphere and in the context of the energy flows that Eric Chaisson has talked about in the story of increasing complexity. To miss that is panic. One more big history question. If energy flows drive increasing complexity, shouldn't historians be obsessed with how human societies manage energy flows? Now, of course, historians do these things, but the point is, I think these things should be much more central than they are. So now I'd like to take a little time pursuing this question. In astronomy, fusion generates the energy flows that drive stars. To understand stars, study fusion. In biology, metabolism describes the mechanisms that organisms use to manage the energy needed to maintain themselves. So to understand life, study metabolism. Okay? But this is fusion. This is the mechanism that explains how stars work. I'm not going to go through the details. This is metabolism. It explains how living organisms work. If you understand an organism's metabolism, you understand a lot about its relationships to environment and about its internal workings. So metabolism is a sort of key to understanding life. So, what's the equivalent concept for historians? Now, I'm going to vote for the word mobilization. We could argue about this endlessly, but let me just make the case for mobilization being the equivalent word for historians. Collective learning means that humans control the energy they use, or most of it, collectively, not as individuals. I don't build my own private steam engine and dig out my own coal. We do these things collectively. So mobilization means the methods humans use to collectively harvest the biospheric energy they need to keep going. But it can be regarded as a key to understanding how societies work. If you look at mobilization of the organic energy regime, agriculture gave more control of biospheric energy. Surpluses could support wealthy elites. So elites had to manage energy in a new way, because they harvested energy not just from the environment, the natural world, but also from other human beings. How did they do that? Well, they did so using what I find it increasingly helpful to describe as mobilization machines. The word state carries so much baggage now that I prefer to dump it and use another word that has at least the element of surprise. So let's talk about mobilization machines. Okay? This is like the machines of metabolism for biology. Here's a cartoon of a mobilization machine. I used this in a book I wrote on vodka that came out in 1990. And my argument was that the trade in vodka was a powerful mobilization machine. It moved wealth up through society, and I did lots of sums on how much the Russian government and elites earned for this trade. So in this cartoon, done during the Russo-Japanese War, money is pumped from peasants and citizens and squeezed out of them. It's pumped up to the government, this boiler at the centre, and meanwhile it's tapped by plenty of others on its way. So that's that mechanism. So this is the sort of image I have in mind. So how do they work in the real world? As a biologist, I think you could think of this as unbalanced symbiosis. You have two groups. They both benefit in some ways from the relationship, but one benefits a lot more than the others. The basic rules of how you mobilize as an elite in the organic world are pretty familiar. First rule, elites have to be disciplined, organized, and networked. They must be more organized, better informed than the villagers or workers from whom they exact resources. Secondly, coercion. Where resources are limited, you can't buy consent. You have to coerce it. You have to have the ability to coerce. Now this rule explains why in the organic energy regime coercion played a huge role in states. It still does, of course, but it works in different ways. protection. The offer of protection works pretty well, as the mafia understands, even if you're protecting people from yourself or from your own agents. Trade works, particularly if you identify groups over which your control is limited. Okay? But you already have to mobilize tradable goods for that to work. Legitimacy is important. You must try to persuade people that you have the right to mobilize their materials. Lineage counts, heaven's mandate counts, all sorts of mechanisms. Charisma counts. Finally, the danger of overexploitation. If you work these machines too hard, they will burst like a boiler. The pressure will be too much. And you can read manuals on statecraft over and over again, and they will say this: squeeze the peasants, yes, but don't squeeze them too hard, otherwise the whole damn thing will break down. So within these constraints, mobilization machines are immensely diverse. Does mobilization equal power? I'm not sure. Almost. Maybe, sort of. I loved Richard Simon's essay in the latest newsletter, Origins, of the IBHA. It just came out. And Richard argues that power is the ability to marshal flows of energy. Now, doesn't that take us straight back to the original arguments of Chesson and Speer? Ultimately, that energy comes from our star. And to quote again, the more energy a human can direct, the more powerful we fellow humans perceive that human to be. I think this is a wonderful idea. It suggests that the power to mobilize creates a sort of force field around you that other people can detect. And this, I suspect, is charisma. This is what Richard says. Humans can perceive the wielder of power as a node through which energy flows and at which energy therefore accumulates. And such nodiness manifests as, I love that technical term, I think that needs to be imported into Greek history, and may also be a result of that other mysterious attractive force, charisma. Okay, it's John Wayne. It's not Genghis Khan, but just a cheap way of making the point. Now here, maybe I'm going mad here, but I did say this was exploratory, okay? In relativity, mass is concentrated energy, and it warps the space around it. Now I'm wondering, as I'm thinking about this, is this what charisma and power would look like if my eyes were tuned to the right wavelength? That's just a question, not sure. But the idea of linking charisma to energy flows is, I think, a brilliant insight. Now back to Russian history. How do mobilization machines work in particular places? That seems to me ought to be a very interesting question for historians. For years, longer than I care to know, I've been working on a history of inner Eurasia. Volume 1 came out in 1998. I'm working on Volume 2 now. I hope it will come out next year. What's inner Eurasia? Very quick description. It's the USSR plus Mongolia plus Chinese Xinjiang. My argument is that this gives you a coherent ecological and geographical zone within which you can ask questions like, how does ecology shape mobilization machines? Here's inner Eurasia, here's outer Eurasia. They're about the same size. Why is inner Eurasia different? Well, first, it's arid. It's remote from ice-free oceans. Precipitation is under 200 inches a year on average throughout this area. It varies, of course, in detail. Secondly, it's northern. January temperatures below 0 degrees, sharp as blue here. High latitudes limit the energy from photosynthesis. So there's an energy limit because of this. There's no Gulf Stream to warm up the region. Agriculture is difficult. Halford Mackinder wrote of this region, at midwinter, as seen from the moon, a vast white shield would reveal the heartland, very close to inner Eurasia, in its largest meaning. So these limitations mean that agriculture bypassed inner Eurasia. Here are the limits of early agriculture in inner Eurasia. Agriculture spreads in outer Eurasia. Populations grow, cities grow, trade grows, all the kit and caboodle of what we call traditionally civilization. Not so much in inner Eurasia, where it nibbles at the edges but makes very little progress for several millennia. Not until 1,500 years ago does agriculture really begin spreading in inner Eurasia. This makes a huge difference to mobilization. There are limited energy flows, smaller populations for mobilization machines to graze on. Now this graph, the blue pillars show the populations of outer Eurasia over 2,000 years. The red pillars show the populations of inner Eurasia over 2,000 years. So inner Eurasian populations were on average 1/10. That surely makes a difference to how you mobilize. And here's a modern graphic showing population densities today to make the point. Topography, it's the largest region of flatlands in the world, is within inner Eurasia. That means that defense in war is difficult, and successful armies or mobilizers can conquer huge areas. So here's the question: how do the ecology and geography of inner Eurasia shape mobilization machines and strategies of mobilization? Well, profoundly. First, elites had to mobilize limited resources over vast areas. Mobility and reach really matter in such a system. That worked pretty well for pastoral nomadic empires, which were mobile by definition. It put a premium on labour rather than land. Labour was scarce relative to land in Eurasia. It put a premium on mobility and reach rather than economic efficiency. It put a premium on centralised leadership because you have to hold together coalitions of elites over vast areas. You can watch Genghis Khan building up this sort of disciplined elite. We know the story very well. And it created the largest land empires in history. The Mongol Empire overflowed in Eurasia, briefly. The Soviet Union almost filled in Eurasia. So it's a coherent zone. Now, and back to Soviet industrialization. This is Magnitogorsk, by the way. In inner Eurasia, mobilization machines were good at direct mobilization of labor, energy, and resources over large areas. They were less good at market efficiencies and innovations. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union built a traditional mobilizational engine without markets. I increasingly see the Stalinist mobilization machine as rather archaic and owing a huge amount to traditional mobilizational structures in Eurasia. Had many archaic elements, highly centralized, disciplined elites, highly reliant on direct coercive mobilization, enthusiasm, and also ingenuity. Huge amounts of popular enthusiasm took part in it. Kaganovich famously said in the 30s, "The earth should tremble when the factory director appears." It was based largely on technologies that originated elsewhere, but adapted often with immense ingenuity to the conditions of the planned economy. It was extremely wasteful. Paul Gregory estimates, and many other people would agree with this, that 84% of Soviet growth depended on increased inputs rather than efficiencies. This is a machine that's very good at harvesting labour, energy, resources, not so good at using what it harvests efficiently. It built a modern industrial base that survived World War II. It succeeded. It worked without markets. But by the 50s, Soviet planners understood the need to use resources more efficiently. Gorbachev in Perestroika famously said that if the sale of oil and alcohol was excluded from calculations of Soviet GDP, this would eliminate the appearance of most growth in output after the mid-60s. Conclusion: a mobilization machine without markets could gather the labour, expertise and resources to take advantage of the fossil fuels bonanza. It's doable. It's very doable. But once you've built the basic machine, and once the point comes where you need to make it work more efficiently, that gets tougher. And that eventually, I think, brought down the Soviet command economy. So these ideas about energy flows, I think, can help us think creatively about the successes and failures of planned economies and the difficulties of balancing mobilization and markets today in the post-Soviet world. So here's my question: is post-Soviet inner Eurasia still shaped by distinctively inner Eurasian strategies of mobilization? Sure. Putin famously said, from the very beginning, Russia was created as a super-centralized state. That's practically laid down in its genetic code, its traditions, and the mentality of its people. I hope Sheila Fitzpatrick might agree that the big history perspective can open up some interesting new research agendas on Soviet and post-Soviet history, or help you see things in a slightly different way. It certainly has for me. So I hope I've illustrated some of the ways in which I think big history can generate powerful synergies across scales and disciplines. This is my grandson Daniel. I think that his generation will need the access to these sort of intellectual synergies as they deal with the fantastically complex challenges of the next 50 years or so. It'll not be enough to stay within one discipline to deal with those challenges. Big history is already helping students and teachers think in new ways. Andrea from Scales Relevant said, I love big history. It allows us to think about the big picture of how we came to be and about life on Earth. The course is tailored to our generation and learning. Maddie L. I never thought that a subject could be so dramatically change my outlook and provide me with such thought-provoking topics that I would happily discuss with anyone for hours on end. A high school teacher from Brooklyn. Students have an instinct to think deeply and feel respected when presented with deep questions. The Big History Project facilitates independent, critical, cross-disciplinary thinking, which is what the real world is about. Our active class discussions and questions reflect this. Wow. So my hope is that by connecting disciplines, big history is pointing us towards the insights future generations will need to cope with the global challenges of the 21st century. I thank you for your attention. I feel I've stretched your attention span longer than I really should have. So I thank you for your attention.